Good evening, everyone. Today is Tuesday, May 14, 2024, and the Salem-Keizer Public Schools Budget Committee meeting is now called to order. It is now...
I don't think the mic is on.
Oh, do I have to do something to make it on?
Let's wait, yeah.
Oh.
Ashley's on it. Yeah.
Okay. Now it sounds like it's on. Good evening. Today is Tuesday, May 14th, 2024, and the Salem-Keizer Public Schools Budget Committee meeting is now called to order. It is now 8:02, I would guess. 8:06.
6:02.
Oh, it's 6, not 8. Oh, my goodness. How is this going to go with the numbers tonight when I can't even get the time right? Okay, it's okay. Everybody relax. I'm going to ask Chrissy Hudson, Director Hudson, to read the land acknowledgement, please.
Hello, everybody. Okay, we are gathered here today on the land of the Kalapuya, who are represented by the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians. The relationship between the Kalapuya people and this land continues unbroken to this day, and we offer gratitude for the land and for the generations present and past who have stewarded the land since time immemorial. We respectfully acknowledge and honor past, present, and future Native American and Indigenous students and staff of the Salem-Keizer Public Schools. We invite you to join us in honoring these ancestral grounds and celebrating the resilience and strength of all Native American and Indigenous people. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Will you all rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, I'm going to take attendance. I'm going to start over here. Linda Pappas is excused. Oscar Porras.
Present.
Patrick Schwab.
Present.
Satya Chandragiri.
Present.
Maria Inahos-Pressy.
Present.
Oh, man.
Patrick was bringing together.
Patrick.
Present.
Cynthia.
Present.
Lisa.
Present.
Karina.
Present.
Kelly.
Present.
Ashley.
Present.
Chrissy.
Present.
And Catherine.
Present. And Laura. Online. Laura.
Oh, Laura, on the
Present.
screen. I'm so sorry.
It's okay.
So we have a good turnout tonight. Thank you all for being here. I've shared with you before that this is not my first time going through a significant budget reduction in Salem-Keizer schools. I was on the board during the recession, and we went through multiple years of reduction, including a reduction in force. I know that it's deeply upsetting, unsettling, painful, scary, and I'd add emotional. And in a highly connected community like ours, it touches all of us. As the Budget Committee Chair, I want to help us do our best work by setting up the clear procedures we will follow today and when we come back together on the 20th. Last week, the superintendent delivered the budget address and introduced us to the budget. Today's session will be dedicated to a little presentation, but also to discussion and questions and answers. Here's how this will work. The superintendent will take us section by section through the budget. She and her team will present some overarching information and then open it up for discussion and questions. Many of your questions are likely ones that the team can answer during the meeting. If there are questions that are more significant and require significant research, we will take a vote on the request. The vote helps determine if there is sufficient committee interest and urgency for the research to be conducted. I will call for a vote on requests that fall into this category, and a majority vote, 8 of the 14-member committee, is required to approve the question for staff response. If, over the course of the meeting, any member of the committee wishes to request a change to the proposed budget, I ask that you share that request today. Not necessarily the substance of the request, but that you're planning to request a change. We'll not call for motions or take votes on requested changes today, but we will take note of them and handle those requests on Monday. And with that, I'll turn this portion over of the agenda over to Superintendent Castaneda.
Thank you, Budget Committee members. We are continuing a very important conversation from last week. And as the chairperson told us, there'll be this time for discussion and questions and answers. So before I jump in, I'm going to tee up a few things. So first, I'll be mostly referencing pages in your budget book as I go through a few things that we want to make sure we add or clarify from our last session. And to the degree that when you ask questions, you can connect them back to pages, that is really helpful. The main reason that it's helpful is that it gives us all something common to look at, and it locates your questions as a budget issue, because there are other families of questions. There are ones that are purely about the proposed budget, which is the purview of this group. There's others that are really about board policy, and that falls into the purview of the board. And then there are some that are about district kind of implementation and authority. So by connecting it back to the budget book, we stay most clearly in the lane that your authority lies in. I also, before I jump in, I want to share something that a community member shared with me and with a group of us. And it came by way of advice. And he said, I think over this period, it will be good for you, he was speaking to me in this instance, to remember the 3 pillars of humility. And so I'm going to start with the 3 pillars of humility as they were shared with me, because I do think they are the emotional grounding of the work we're doing. So one is, just to be clear that this work we're doing together requires the help of everyone. We need your help today as a budget committee, but we are going to need the community's help, our staff's help broadly as we organize for recovery. The next is to just be really honest about the fact that I and we are so sorry for the pain and the hardship and the anxiety that's unfolding in our schools. Our apology is not about saying that this shouldn't be happening, because it is a responsibility. But our apology is about an honest reflection that when we see pain in our organization or in others, we really see it. We don't look away. And then finally, to express gratitude, because as much as these months have been hard and these culminating weeks are going to be hard, it really has required just so much dedication. Across this whole room, I have had hours with you. And those are hours that you chose to dedicate to this, not to other things that might be equally or maybe more worthy. So we're very grateful. And with that, I'm going to jump in. We have a very short deck that we'll use as a visual anchor, but mostly we'll be using the budget books. So in the general overview portion, which you'll see really starts as an introduction and begins on page 3, I want to just take us back to something that was in the budget address. If you could advance this. Oh, Emily, is it you? Advance the slide 1. Excuse me, I'm going to take this off. It's going to keep rattling. This situation that we're in is now officially happening throughout Oregon. much earlier in the year, in the summer, in the early fall. As a district, we were saying, hey, Oregon, something is coming. And we were amongst the first saying it, and for a long time, silence was coming back, or even active skepticism. But now it is as much a part of the education news as anything else that's happening. So just before I came, I did a quick run on this, and this is not everyone, but this is what I could see as of today. Salem-Keizer, Westland, Wilsonville, Portland, Medford, Bend, Corvallis, Ashland, Jervis, Silverton, Lake County. Every one of those districts is making reductions right now. The moment we're in is about the forces in the context. It is very tempting to say that it's about something else, because the appeal of blame is so energized in moments like this. Blame feels easy, but weathering things like this when they come to us is hard, and it takes the courage that this board and this committee are bringing. And also, the next steps will require that same kind of courage. Can you advance to the next slide? This is a quick reminder of the work that has brought us here. We talked about it a little bit last week, but I'm going to do it one more time. So in August, we started doing budget addresses and talking about the issue. In the fall, we had our first round of community conversations. And if I remember correctly, there were about 900 people that provided feedback in person or through a survey. In December, we announced the round 1 reductions. They were recommendations. There was no board action. In the spring, we completed bargaining. That was in like the range of March. And that allowed us to lock in all of our forecasts and be more precise about where we stood financially for the 24-25 year and beyond. And then in April, the board approved a resolution for a reduction in force. That was unanimous, but I think incredibly painful action on the part of the board. Since then, we've been preparing our school system for that. And on Friday, all of our employees, every single employee, is going to receive a notice that tells them about their job status for the 24-25 school year. That is the completion, the technical completion of the work that the board approved in April. That brings us then to your deliberations and the approval of this budget. So it's been a series of increments, each increment kind of bookended by public communication and in some cases board action. Can you go to the next slide, please? Oh, I've been forgetting to tell you page numbers, but if I had, that would have been on page 6. This is a chart we're bringing back from the last session because we're now into content that we want to go deeper on or clarify with you. So first at a high level, I'll just kind of introduce everyone to this graph. The graph shows staffing changes since 2007. It's between 2007 and 23-24. The reason that those two dates are in there is that it provides roughly benchmarked levels of enrollment. In 2007, we served about the same number of students that we served in the 23-24 year. The black line shows you change of enrollment over that period, and you can see the scale on the right. And I just want to call your attention to the fact that scale doesn't end at 0. So it looks like a real crash, but it's partially because it's on a compressed scale. Now, onto the bar charts. The things that I want to point out to you guys here is that these show the darker of them, the maroon color, that is our licensed staffing numbers. The kind of speckled white, which people have pointed out is the body of the cigarette. That is our classified staffing level. And the yellow, which is obviously what makes it look like a cigarette, is the proportion of administrators, all administrators. There's a few really important things that we want to remind and reshare about this data. The first is that although we're serving the same number of students over that period, we have 46% more staff than we did in 2007. That's growth of every single job group. There are many conversations that we could have about why we, as a school system, absolutely need more people to serve the same number of students. But for today, the broad trends are the important part of the budget. The other thing that's less visible but true in this graph is that over this period, the bulk of the growth has been driven by classified expansion. And this is not just a Salem-Keizer trend. This is actually a trend that is visible and even more extreme in Oregon than in our national benchmarks. That is, the number of classified staff, it's almost doubled in that period. Again, I'm going to say every job group grew, but the proportions of our total workforce, classified, licensed, and administrative, have been shifting. So this is a really important part of our financial story. It is also a really important part of our workforce and our schools' story. Okay, can you go to the next slide? This is a similar graph, but you just showed in a slightly different way so that it is a little bit easier. You're not looking at the stacked bar, a little bit easier to see the growth we're talking about. So this is the same data, but we've added 2 tailing years there. So you'll see the red that's a drop. That just reflects the proposed budget. If you go back to the years that our chairperson was mentioning, you can see it in this graph even. You can see the reduction in force in the 11-12 year. That drop right there and those low years were the recession years. And you can see very clearly, cleared the recession, and mostly we've just climbed in staffing levels since then. Can you go to the next graph, please? There's been a lot of conversation over the months that I have been here about administrative growth. And I have mostly not spoken in detail about it. And I will not speak in detail about it tonight, but I will address it through these numbers. Our workforce grew by an additional 50% over that period. The proportion of administrators to our workforce has been, for the most part, with the exception of that one peak year, pretty level. We're looking at between 3.2 and 3.9%, which is to say we have hired more administrators. That is true. In proportion to the rather significant growth of our workforce. When these numbers are extracted and presented separately, it tells a different story than the story in aggregate. And with the reductions that we're recommending as part of this proposed budget, we will have nearly, it's a horse race, nearly the lowest ratio that we've had in the last 17 years. We cut administrators first, we cut them deepest, and we froze their wages. And we are now dropping down to nearly the lowest level in 17 years. There are many other stories that can be told about administrative growth and administrative change, but this is at least part of the story. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so now we are going to go to budget book pages, and we will start on your page 10, which should match this graph. This is so familiar to us now that I'm actually not going to walk us through it. I'm going to focus on 4 numbers. They are the last 3 numbers and then one that I'm going to add in. So the last 3 numbers, this is based on this proposed budget, based on budgeted expenses and projected revenue, where we will end the 24-25 year. I'll say that again because this is often a point of confusion. This is where we will end next year. Not start next year, not end this year, end next year. All right, first number, 60. That is our projected ending fund balance based on all budgeted expenditures. $60 million is right in the middle of our policy targets. It's at 9%. It represents about, Sarah, I'm going to say 6 weeks of payroll. Is that about right? Not all district expenses, just payroll. The second number I'm going to focus on is the 587. That is budgeted expenses in the general fund. When we say budgeted expenses, what we mean is if we spent every cent of what the budget committee and the board approve, and if it was exactly this proposed budget, that's how much we would spend out of the general fund. The third number is 560. This is our projected general fund revenue. And here, of all of these numbers, it's the most stable because we're in the second year of a biennium. At this point, we're not guessing about that number. The fourth number is the difference between 587 and 560. It's a $27 million budgeted expense to revenue gap that is still sitting in this budget. What this means is if we spent this budget exactly as proposed, we will spend $27 million next year more than we are bringing in. This means that we cut or adjusted 70 million out and we left 27 in. And it's because we're trying to hit this precarious balance. The balance is do everything we can to strengthen our financial standing. Do everything we can to prepare for what's coming, some of which is unknowable. But not push so far that we actually start to fundamentally tear schools down. If there are no significant changes in state aid, which we cannot count on right now in the new biennium. We cannot. As much as we can be hopeful, we cannot count on them. If there are no significant changes, and if we manage this budget with an enormous amount of care, we can move that 27 million down to a number that I think will prevent us from being back here running a reduction in force again next year. That is the goal right now. Do what we can, don't push too far, and do not put our system through this for 2 consecutive years, because it is horrible. I'm gonna linger on a couple of these points a little bit more, because I have received many emails from people that say that $60 million is too much. And I want to address a couple of things about that. First, it is within policy targets, so if one wishes to debate the adequacy of the policy targets, that is a matter to take up with the board, but it is right in the middle. It is 6 weeks of payroll, and I think for any other employer of our size, if you were to hear that Salem Health only has 6 weeks of payroll on hand, it would feel a little concerning. These are major institutions upon which all of our citizens rely. So it is not a huge cushion. I also want to address the fact that that money is one-time money. It sits in a savings account, and when you spend it, it is gone. If you spend it on expenses that reoccur, you've spent the savings, all you have left is the structural deficit. We cannot keep spending our ending fund balance on people and expect this problem to resolve itself. It will not. Finally, for each 1% of our policy targets, so let's say we were going to go from 9 down to the floor, which is 7, the lowest of the board policy targets. Each of those percentages is about 6.5 million. So let's just say you're like, all right, we're going to go all the way down to 7. Then I fear we will be riffing next year too, because what that is going to do is add $13 million on top of the 27. It's not about the ending fund balance. It's about the structural imbalance and getting it to a point that we can manage it without exposing our system to horrible turmoil. Differences of opinion exist on this. I know that. But our team has done the very best that we know how to do to hit that balance and to protect us to the degree that we reasonably can from doing this again next year. Okay, so with that, I'm actually going to turn it over to Sarah Head for a moment just to check in. Is there anything, Sarah, on that point to add, address, clarify, or correct? Okay. That takes us through the introductory portion.
Do you want questions, if there are any?
Yeah, I'm actually going to pause right there because that is everything I have for the introduction. And so we'll pause here for questions. When the questions are exhausted, we'll go on to the next section.
Anyone who has questions? You raise your hand. Is there a way to see Laura?
Oh,
She does not have her hand up. She does not have her hand up. She said.
Oh, thank you.
They can, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Catherine?
I just have a really quick point of clarification. So 60 million as a beginning fund balance, is that correct?
ending fund balance.
Ending fund balance, but a beginning fund balance of, we have an assumption in the budget of 87 million. Okay.
And if I can add something there, that 87 million is the result of a lot of work this year. So this year, we've been holding expenses as low as we can and making adjustments even to this fiscal year. So that, we've been trying to pump this year's ending / next year's beginning fund balance up so that even as it starts to fall, it only falls to within policy targets. Without the corrective action that we've taken this year, even with the reductions, we would still have fallen out of policy targets next year.
Satya?
Thank you very much, Chair. We are required to balance the budget when we pass. So by leaving that 27 million gap, would that allow us to meet whatever is called a balancing the budget within that? Would you mind addressing that and helping me understand?
I'm gonna do a slightly amateur job, which is just long enough for Sarah to know that she's gonna do the rest of it. The notion of a balanced budget is a little bit misleading if we think about it from a home budget, because if this were a home budget, we would be out of money. What we're required to do is have a budget that, well, meets policy standards by your demands, but also ensures that we have enough money to get through the year based on our forecast revenue and expenses. We do have that because of the ending fund balance, but the numbers don't touch. Sarah, what will you add?
No.
How about now?
Oh,
That was exact. Oregon budget law requires your revenue and your expenditures to be the same number, but you bring in your beginning fund balance so that we can balance. And we've been scraping it together with beginning fund balance.
Chair, can I follow up with a question?
Certainly.
Thank you. We don't get the the ODE does not send us all the money at the one time. They send it around 11 months, I was told. So it depends on enrollment or all those fluctuations. And so if we, for some reason, the enrollment changes and the ODE sends us less money, and if we have only 6 weeks of payroll money, and how will we take care of that? For some reason, there is a delay because there's a 2-year cycle. Because we are talking about 2025. I don't know if I'm making sense.
You're making perfect sense. So everything in here in this budget is built on assumptions, including enrollment. And if our enrollment drops more, or if, heaven forbid, I think Nancy would remember during the recession, there was a mid-year correction, and ODE will literally send out reports that say your revenue is less for the year, and districts are required to adjust to that. So that is another thing that having a fund balance protects us from, so that we don't end up like some of our neighboring districts.
I'll add to that that we have at this point gotten within less than 1% margin of error in enrollment forecasting. And therefore, the anticipated continued drop in enrollment is already part of our revenue forecasting, and it will always stretch forward. So there is a certain amount of naturally occurring forecasting conservatism that's in the way that we manage, especially across biennium.
Will this gap of 27 million affect our bond rating is another question.
I don't believe so, because part of what is really important to bond rating is that you as a board and we as an organization have taken proactive measures to ensure our financial sustainability. And the story of this year is about that proactive work.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Okay. I'd like to use the opportunity to ask for a little more clarification on a prior discussion we had about possibly regarding student decline, what our incoming balance projects. I always thought it was direct, but it sounded like there's a bit of a buffer, and there's federal funding that still continues to come into the district, maybe just less of a percentage per se child, if that's easiest math to answer the question, that exits the district.
I think we can help with that. Sarah and I will have to tag team that. There's really, I think you had 2 parts of the question, which we're going to separate, and then we'll kind of recombine at the end. But for purposes of the budget book, page 16 is probably one of the better places to look at this. Page 16 shows from a state school fund perspective, from a state funding formula perspective, changes in enrollment. So you'll see that first column is average enrollment. Then you have average daily membership weighted, which includes our per pupil weights, and then extended average daily membership weighted. The extended number is part of the number that Director Chandragiri was talking about, because the state's approach does create a buffer by blending the two, taking the average, is that right, Sarah? The average of the 2 previous years? The higher of the 2 previous years. So if you're stepping down, you're kind of always slightly protected from the lowest point. Now, there is a bottom eventually, but that's the way it's designed to work. That is part of our forecasting and part of our management, so these numbers are not surprises to us in classrooms or in finances. The federal side is a little bit different. The federal side is not based specifically on the number of students we have in seats. It's based on a combination of factors, but largely it's census data. And so that comes from the feds to the state, and then from the state to us. it's less responsive to individual movement. If a new apartment complex moves in or something changes in a neighborhood, that the federal funding is not sensitive to that. But it does track broad changes. The volatility in federal funding tends to be more connected to what they appropriate at a federal level than it does changes in census data. And that is only fractionally within our control, I suppose. Did that answer your question?
Yes, it helps a lot. Thank you so much.
Other questions? Ashley?
Thank you. I wanted to just go back to the staffing overview, the cigarette slide, for lack of a better term for it. So I just have a few questions about this one, because it's come up so many times in the community. Could you tell us a little bit about how we define, quote, admin? It seems like a big kind of nebulous bucket of folks that I don't quite fully understand, and I don't think the community fully understands. So that would be part one. And then on the chart, it's difficult to tell in the yellow how many people that is. So like a rough estimate of how many, because it still seems like there's a lack of clarity from the folks I keep hearing from around, like, while we have a very small percent and, you know, even benchmark nationally, all of that stuff, just clarity around how many there are, how we define them. And yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
So when we pull this data, we're using the definition of an administrator as somebody who is not in either of the two bargaining units and has supervisory responsibilities. The numbers, I don't actually have the full data sheet in front of me, but I can tell you a little bit about it. I think that the 23-24 number is right around 190. And that includes over 120 school-based administrators. So building principals and assistant principals. This year, if I remember correctly, we are right at around 60 district administrators. So you can, this year's number I'm pretty sure is 191. So it gives you a little bit more data about the proportionality inside the yellow and how we get to it.
Thank you.
Other questions? Ashley, you look like you have another.
If no one else wants to go. Okay. Going back to the ending fund balance discussion and being within our policy targets, I'm probably one of the people that has raised that to say, can we be a little less conservative? Because I feel, you know, like we all do, the pressure to ensure that we have as many people remaining in our classrooms as possible. I think everyone's feeling all that pressure nonstop. And so it just begs that question for me of, like, if we go down by 1% towards 7%, you said that's about $6 million. And so that's just sort of, you know, it's your position then tonight that that means, you know, if we drop by 1% within our policy targets, that you firmly believe at this moment that puts us in a RIF situation next year.
Okay, I'm going to answer that. But also, if you'll indulge me, my watch is beeping because there's a correction I need to make on my definition of supervisor. So I want to go back and clean that up. And thank you, Bob Silva, for watching so carefully. The definition also includes pro-tech with supervisory roles. So,
What does that mean?
oh, geez.
Bob?
Well, we don't want this to all come through my watch,
Can we
so I think
beam
we
him
might need to
back?
kick it to Suzanne.
We have a classification of staff within our school district we refer to as ProTech, and these are individuals who do not sit within either bargaining unit, but they are also not classified as administrators, to your original question. They may have some level of supervisory responsibility in the district, but not the way we typically define. And there are many ProTech individuals who do not have supervisory responsibilities, which is why we do not include them as a class in that definition.
I'll actually send it back to you, Chairperson, because I think there might be a follow-up question.
Catherine, do you have a question?
So ProTech, what is it that they do?
Yeah, I can offer some more information there. We might have some individuals in the audience who are part of the ProTech group, but ProTech is an abbreviation for professional and technical. And within the rules and laws in the state of Oregon, there is a classification of individuals that can be excluded from bargaining units and considered salary who perform, let's say, technical work is a great example. We have several individuals within our technology department that are ProTech, and because of the nature of their responsibility, they are asked to perform duties that require flexibility in schedule, for example, extending their day, coming in on the weekends, sometimes working more than 40 hours a week. And the law allows us to classify them separately as exempt employees from what would typically be considered hourly wage laws.
Okay, quick follow-up. So their IT support?
That's one example. We do have
Okay.
others in the district, but that's an example of how that works.
Okay.
One of the things that I want to just, again, thank Bob, but also tell you is I would much rather be publicly corrected than wrong in front of you. So for the rest of the team that's also watching while they're multitasking, please feel free to correct anything else. Accuracy in this moment, even if it requires a little bit of cleanup, is so much more important than elegance.
Catherine, did you have a follow-up on, in the midst of this, or a new topic?
Well, I think the, I know we have to submit questions and we vote as a committee whether or not, but I think looking into the admin portion and maybe getting a list of what the responsibilities of each job is there would be helpful. I would like to propose that as a question for the research.
Can I clarify, are you asking for a job description for every unique job description of the 191?
Yeah, I don't need full-on PDs, but just like what they do, like a sentence or two for that cigarette butt light portion.
I have a question directly related to Director Cunningham, if I can.
Okay, I'm going to write down that request, and we'll deal with it at the end.
Okay.
And so then I'm going to move on to Kelly, who is going to ask a question about Ashley's question.
And maybe this will require some research, but the question of can those who set those limits make them a little more flexible under the circumstances makes me want to ask, given what we're looking at right here, right now, how does a positive ending balance even get created over time? Like, what makes that possible? Because if using the example of just 1%, how hard is it to come back up 1% 5 years from now to get us back where we should be all the time? Does that make sense? So in other words, how did we get to 75 in 2020? Is that the result of decisions that were made in 2015 or 2010? Was it the result of saving federal money that came in over the last couple of years? Like, if you're going to spend it down by an additional 1%, what's going to get it back where it should be next year, the year after, the year after? And this is a personal edification question. I don't know how that works.
I think I'm going to lean on Sarah still, but I think I'm going to loop back on that, but start with Director Carson Cottingham's question about the percentages. So I'm going to restate, make sure I understand. You're saying, am I saying that I believe that a difference of 1% saves us from a RIF next year?
Well, that was sort of the gist of it, but where my heart is can we be more conservative, or I mean, less conservative in the ending fund balance? You know, or is that like, are you feeling like we are absolutely at the cliff? Because I know the harm that doing this another time could cause, so I get that calculation.
So I need to put a couple of asterisks on my certainty because none of us know what will happen in education funding in the new biennium. Maybe we get no more money. Maybe we get 30 million. Maybe we get something in between. It is, in moments like this, it is my nature, but it is also, I believe, my responsibility to prepare for something that generally matches history. And with the exception of SIA, we're not seeing big increases from the state that outpace real expenses. So if history repeats itself into the new biennium, it will be a struggle to close that gap at all. The way we will do it is vacancy savings, and because of a reduction in the force this year, we're gonna have far less, an unknowable amount, but far less vacancy savings. And it's because there'll be a recall list, so the moment we have a resignation or a retirement, instead of having a 4 or 6 or 12-week delay, during which we're saving just a little bit on that vacancy, we're gonna have a person to recall into that very quickly. I hope we can count on a 2% vacancy savings rate. And that will take 27 down by about 10 million. In other words, the naturally occurring conservative predictable estimate only cuts that by half. Any that we leave in there, and we cannot close through expense management and vacancy savings, rolls into the new biennium where it gets bigger because of the impacts of personnel increases, and it has to be accommodated somewhere. So coming back to your question, we have agonized over this. And what we bring you is our collective best thinking. I really, really hoped that we could leave not more than 15 in, and we're bringing you 27. Meaning we didn't even get to the point that we felt would be truly closing this budget gap. I think I've answered it, that part to the best of my ability on the what causes an ending fund balance to exist. And then I think more to your point, some of those changes are driven by factors outside of predictable state aid. So what happens if we start playing with those numbers? I'm going to ask for help from Sarah and Suzanne on this, but I believe the 99 number is largely driven by, that high point is largely driven by the arrival of $151 million in federal recovery money. In other words, that will not happen again. Spending down from that to the ceiling of our policy range, which is 12%, I think. Spending down to 12 shouldn't be of concern to us. That's actually just getting right to the point where we are doing our very best to optimize resources for our school. What keeps it at that, say, 60 range or maybe even the 75 range is good financial forecasting and management. The difference between 60 and 75 is, yes, it's 15 million, but inside of our policy range, that's actually just kind of naturally occurring variation, not an inherent cause for concern. But I think the core of your question is, if you isolate every unpredictable source of revenue, how hard is it to get back up? It's $6.5 million in this budget. That's how hard it is. That's $6.5 million in reductions or adjustments that have to come from somewhere else in order to inch it back up. With 60 being right in the middle and also less than many standards suggest, which is 2 full months of expenses, that's just 6 weeks of payroll. I think we're at about the spot we need to be. Sarah, additions, corrections? Suzanne?
Before I go to Satya, I want to know if we're done down here? Got answers to your questions? Okay. Satya?
Thank you, Chair. You know, when the COVID hit, we had to suddenly buy like 10,000 internet hubs, and we had to come up with an emergency funding. Thank God we had some savings from the whatever that digital fund or whatever it is. So, but there is a policy, if I'm right, called commingling of funds. So we finally got the reimbursement from somewhere else eventually. So my question is, if this end fund balance goes down very little, we're talking about 6 weeks of payroll. If there is an emergency like that, where will that money come from on top of paying our staff, whatever the basic salary? So I'm a little worried after that, but that was a very traumatic experience for us to suddenly come up with 10,000 hubs, that internet hotspot or something like that. So I believe in the historically, even once lightning hit and one bus got burned down or something, someone was telling me. So there are some emergencies that will come up. And so we need to have a little bit of the rainy fund in addition to making the payroll for such expenses for a system of such large, because some of the restricted funds will have limitation. Even if you take from that and put it in this bucket, we have to reimburse that. So that's my cautionary note based on our experience during the COVID.
Catherine?
Sorry. I just have so many questions on the revenues, because I know, Sarah, that so much of these assumptions on the next budget are based on what we're going to get out of ODE and what we can expect through the general fund and the state school fund. And I think it's just, for a lot of Oregonians, very frustrating, because we saw record-breaking amounts go into the general fund. Not only, and that bleeds into the state school fund with lottery, who also saw record-breaking revenue-generated amounts. We have money coming in from property taxes. We have the common school fund, which also issues out. I think we got $5 million, which I was really surprised. It's one of the oldest funds we have in the state. And then a little known fact is the corporate kicker. Everybody knows about the personal income tax kicker, but the corporate kicker goes back to states. And so, and then you have the student success fund for corporate activity taxes. And so billions of dollars are being poured into education in the state of Oregon. And it's so, I went through this budget, and it is well done. I really want to commend the district for how hard you worked. I know I had 1,000 questions, and you answered them. I have more. But I really went through this, and it just is such a failure on the part of the state to adequately fund schools. And it's really frustrating, because it feels like we have a giant bucket that has a giant hole in it, and as it moves from the state school fund to education service districts, I guess, to districts, and then to schools, and then to classrooms, my kids' classrooms feel very much like the last on that priority list. And it's really frustrating when we put in as taxpayers so much money, and at the end, my son is sitting in a classroom. I mean, his previous classroom was 36 kids. So obviously, I don't know what's going on, but something's getting lost in translation of this money moving as many times as it does. It's not getting to classrooms, but it feels like we have a lot of systems and contracts built around getting money in the name of teachers and kids, and it's not actually ending up with teachers and kids. And so I think that, and I know that you have said this, I know that several school districts around the state have felt this pressure. And I think you've done a very good job of articulating that this isn't adequate. And it's just not adequate, and it's frustrating. I want to know where the money's going, with billions going into the state of Oregon, billions going into that state school fund, billions going into corporate activity tax, and billions coming in from property tax. And my kid is in an overstuffed classroom with a tired teacher. So I commend the district for the communication. I commend it for this budget. I did go through it, looking for what I could. And it's unfortunate with the RRS 294, we can just kind of pencil whip around the edges for this iteration of the budget. But we have a structural problem, and I know you know that. But if you need me to, I'd be more than happy to help and look into that because it is very frustrating.
We feel that frustration too, and I think knowing actually your specific proficiency with budgets, I completely know that when you say you went through it, you went through it. And what this budget as a document does is track with pretty great precision where everything is going. I don't believe there is a mystery inside this budget book, but I do believe that there is a disparate impact in our classrooms. And when we look up, we can't see all of the transitions that go on before the money gets to us. And I believe at least partially what you're saying is the transition from the taxpayer to each intermediate body that manages and disperses. Somewhere along the line, it feels that billions of dollars are just slowly leaking out. I can't speak to that part. I don't know what those systems look like. I don't know what those partners look like or those contracts look like. I don't know that much about all the little shoots above us. But what we know is what happens once it lands in our accounts. And we have cut expenses, we've cut contracts, we've cut what often gets referred to as stuff and things by 10%. We've slashed transfers. We've slashed the debt service on the additional debt service on PERS. We've cut everything we know how to cut, and still 30 kids and a tired teacher and an instructional assistant and an office manager and a principal is a story of our schools right now.
I just want to editorialize just for a second. I want to make sure that I'm understanding, that the room is understanding, that the public is understanding. What was just said by Catherine was not saying that the bucket leaks are in Salem-Keizer, but that the bucket leaks are before we get the money. Is that accurate to what you're saying?
Yes, it is. I mean, I have a few pencil whips on the budget itself. I mean, asset management, there's a few of those, but this is really well done. Salem-Keizer's done great at answering a lot of the questions I had through the last couple of months, but absolutely, I cannot track from the state school fund down to this district. And I do that for fun sometimes, and I can't. And I think that's, just a concern. It's not transparent, it's not clear. And I'd like for the state to really track. I mean, some of the states have flipped the funding model where you start with the classroom, and then you go to the school, and then you go to the district, and then you go to the state. So instead of us cutting, anytime there's a budget hiccup, cutting teachers and classroom support, you're looking at special initiatives and projects that you're not going to do instead, which makes sense because there's no special initiative or project that's going to make up for a classroom that's packed with 36 kids. So.
Thank you. I see Cynthia's hand is up and Satya's hand is up again. So Cynthia.
I too think that the team has worked really, really hard to get us to this place. And no, it's not good enough. But until the state does something differently, I think this is where we have to land. And I can say that the governor is taking this very, very seriously. She has an accountability team that she has named. They meet every other week and have been meeting and will continue to meet through October, looking at every pot of money that comes into the state, how effective it is or ineffective it is. And she's waiting on that team to give her some recommendations. She didn't want to do the Band-Aid effect where you dump some money and still end up where we are. She's working really, really hard to get to the root cause of the problem And yes, it's bigger than Salem-Keizer. It's the state.
Thank you. Satya?
Well, for me, I need some clarification. Like, unlike Massachusetts, which has a progressive funding model, we have a very regressive funding model. And the same structure has been continuing. But some of the, like, Catherine, when you mentioned that corporate kicker tax or whatever, corporate activity tax, because some of them, if you can help us understand what is a restricted and unrestricted fund, because sometimes it's confusing. The SIA appears to be unrestricted or restricted, I'm not sure, but it does have certain limited functions which can't spend it on everything else, like Title I is a restricted thing. So what is the real dollar which we can use for, salaries and wages? And for a large thing, that would really help, because sometimes I'm asked, why did we buy a car instead of paying a salary? To me, my understanding is limited, whether it's a restricted one or unrestricted one.
I'm also going to ask for a little bit of help from Sarah on this. And if, with your permission, Chair, I'm going to quickly just jump back to Director Richardson's comment. I feel hopeful, but I also believe that while you hope, you organize. We cannot wait on hope. Hope can evaporate in the strangest ways. And that is part of the reason that this budget season, superintendents across the state are not letting the fact that we are not in a long session deter advocacy. The fact that you're seeing story after story come up right now, that is not an accident. That is organizing. And we are not the best organizers in the room. The best organizers in the room are the audience. Our associations are the best organizers in the room. But for now, we hope and we believe, we collaborate and we organize. Because pressure is part of what will galvanize the change, I believe. Going to your question, I'm going to move us to page 25 for now. Sarah, I might just tee it up here and then hand it over to you because I don't want to get any of this wrong. So page 25, you'll see a chart that shows all funds, and then you'll see on the left, general fund, 57.5, and on the right, you'll see 42.5, restricted, committed, or assigned. And then you'll see that is then subdivided into a series of different groups: special revenue, debt service, capital projects, internal service funds. The special revenue funds, I believe, are a big part of Satya's question. Is that right?
Grants.
Yeah, grants. So you're right, the general fund is our unrestricted account. We can use it for virtually anything that is legal and appropriate for a school system to buy. Once you get into these other categories, there are increasingly restrictive rules, some more, some less. Sarah, I'm going to hand it over to you to kind of just give us a quick overview, probably actually between the two of you guys, SIA, kind of the big ones, and then we'll bring it home with an answer about cars.
So you're familiar with our grants, right? SIA, Title I, all of those run through the restricted funds, and each of those grants has a different initiative or several different strategies and initiative that we follow. So when people are asking you about resources that are available for anything, that would be the general fund. In those grants, if they work on programs associated with those grants, then those funds could be used.
To add to the response, particularly with our federal grants, there's this concept of supplanting. The federal money that comes to us for Title I, which is one of the grants that you referenced, has very strict supplanting laws. And what that means in practice is that if we are providing something to our schools using general fund resources, we cannot take away those general fund resources and instead use title monies for a specific role, for example. We can, in some cases, add, so we can do more of, come on top of, that's called supplementing. We can bring in different positions, or we can bring in additional positions, but we can't substitute. That would be supplanting. So we have to be very careful about use of federal funds in particular in regard to staffing. So it's not a blanket no, we can't use those resources for staffing. It's that we must use them the way they are intended. Extending that just a bit further into our grants, each grant is earmarked for a specific student population or a specific function. Title I is a good example. It's to be used for students who are experiencing poverty. Title III is another example. It's to be used for students who are learning English as a second or other language. So we must fit within the rules in order to use those monies for any purpose, let alone staffing.
I have a question.
Catherine?
Sorry, real quick. Sarah, this is one of my pencil whip on the budget. Is the Asset Replacement Fund 222? I know that it's a common budget strategy to, when you look at asset management, if you turn over your fleet or your technology every 4 years, you elongate that 5, 6 years. Is that so protected by federal funds that, did we look into that at all when we looked at our budget, is looking at asset management and elongating those timelines for replacement?
We certainly did, and you'll notice that the transfers declined on some things that we could be flexible with. Some of that is debt service, and so for transportation, it's debt service, so obviously not flexible.
Okay.
Can you reference a page, Catherine?
Yeah, that's
It's
on.
on 26.
Thank you.
And so, yes, and also the detail on asset replacement is on 114. And in some ways, I actually think that probably tells a more complete story, because you'll see the version that Sarah was talking about. For those of you who have been tracking closely since December, you'll remember we made certain commitments about transfers that we were going to eliminate or freeze. So you'll see here on page 114, you'll say interfund transfer vehicles, 0. Technology, 0. Equipment and furniture, 0. That's where we started zeroing out everything that we could, because you're right, that is an important part of management. What we want you to know that's still in here. So you'll see a transportation line that is proposed for $3,310,000. That's debt service, correct, Sarah? So not really something that we can touch. You'll see here also curriculum, $5 million. And we can go back to a conversation from just the last board meeting. We are under a state corrective action plan for curriculum adoption. This $5 million is with us seeking slowdowns and exceptions from the state. And even with this, I am not sure that we can afford the curriculum that they're requiring us to buy. There is an open matter before the state superintendent about slowing down our adoption schedule. We brought it to them once, they kicked it back to us. We signed it and sent it right back again. Because buying more curriculum faster to comply with an arbitrary state schedule in a climate like this does not make sense. But high quality curriculum does make sense. So that's what you see here. And hopefully that gives you like just another bird's eye view on that issue.
Maria?
I guess to that point, on page 115, the 2550 under student transportation services, we went on depreciable bus garage, bus and capital bus improvements in 22-23 of like $2.5 million, and then in last year's budget it went up to $25 million, and now we're going back down to 16 million. So I don't know if we have any information on what that increase was.
Absolutely. So when we did our full faith and credit borrowing, it was for the Gaffin facility and for buses. And so we have borrowed money and specifically said we will use it for buses. And then, of course, COVID slowed the delay. So we did not stop buying yellow buses. We have some compliance issues there, and we borrowed money for them. So what you're seeing is the remainder of that will roll out. And I don't know for sure that it will be 16. It kind of depends on when things get delivered. They may come in this year.
I'm not seeing anyone else. Oh, I am. Chrissy.
A little tiny piggyback to that one. The reason for the borrowing, that happened during the COVID time when there had to be less students per bus, or can we get a little backstory on that?
No, it was
Okay.
actually 2020, I believe. Summer of was when we did the issuing, but it wasn't COVID related. It was related to the age of our fleet and some changes in regulations about what your fleet had to comply with. So instead of having money going every year to asset replacement, like Catherine was talking about, we decided to borrow and do it because we couldn't fund it the other way.
Deep breath. I think that's the end of the questions on that section.
Okay, the next page that I would like to take you to is page 17 in your book, which shows allocation ratios. We want to spend some time on this, and I'm going to do my best to field questions, but it is possible, bordering on probable, that we'll need to hold on some of the more detailed ones until our deputy superintendents can join. They are, by the way, working on a project that is extremely important to our schools and relates to the work that we're doing on Friday. And I hope you will agree with our judgment that it is more important that we do that at a level of excellence than staff this meeting. So I'm going to share with you information about ratio and class size and what we see happening next year based on the proposed reductions and the reduction in force that's underway. So first you'll see on page 17 our allocation ratios. And then on the subsequent page, you might remember, you'll see the Salem-Keizer Education Association targets. This is, I hope it is fair to say that in ideal funding, this is what our association would recommend our class sizes to be. You can kind of flip back and forth. It gives you a sense of, kind of a rough sense. But we're going to stay on ratio for a minute because ratio is a different measure than class size, and it produces a lot of confusion in the world. Ratio is also a different measure in elementary settings than it is in secondary, where there is a lot more variability. And so ratio both benefits and suffers from the law of averages. In effect, we could have an allocation method that allocates a ratio of 1 licensed FTE to 25 students. But if you walk into any elementary school, you'll see differences above and below that ratio. We committed to you and to the public that this year we are holding elementary ratio harmless. We are not increasing ratio. There is an imperfect but definitely linear relationship between ratio and class size. If ratio goes up, class size goes up. We are holding elementary harmless in terms of ratio, but some classes will go up. And it is because, especially at elementary school, we had class size reduction teachers that were ESSER funded. We started with 54 of them. So we did have classes, they were not the norm, but we had classes that were 15, 18. We will not have that anymore. We will have more blends next year. We're anticipating that we are going to have somewhere between 30 and 40 additional blends. And blending is when you take two classes that are imbalanced in terms of size, but two different grade levels, and use it to balance out class size. It's not ideal for anyone, but it does live up to ratio. I think that it is a fair thing to say that most teachers do not like blends. I think it is fair to say that most parents do not like blends. And when we hear the most common stories of elementary classes that are significantly above ratio, it is usually because there was a discussion and a preference to a bigger class size than to a blend, which gives you a sense of how challenging blends can be. I was in a classroom last week talking to a first-year teacher with a 2-3 blend. The very first thing out of her mouth was, "This blend is hard, and I am in my first year." But this is how we can hold ratio. The middle and high school ratios are just fundamentally different beasts. And it's because at those levels, and especially at high school, and our student advisor can attest to this, there are classes of all different sizes. It's much less stable, especially when you get into outside the core and into elective areas where there might be more advanced coursework or you have to progress your way into it. Class size tends to go down in those. But in the core areas, there will be an increase in class size. So I want to give you, now we've switched over. We're not talking about ratio here. Now we're talking about class size. I want to give you kind of a sense of what we think this is going to look like now that we have schedules starting to come in. So in high school, in the core, math, English language arts, science, and social studies, we are seeing numbers that are between like again, bear with me because there's hundreds of classrooms, but there are numbers between 30 and 33 in math, somewhere in the range of 34 in ELA, 31 to 35 in science, 30 to 35 in social studies. There are going to be classes that are maybe a few that are at the bottom. There may be some that are higher. But we don't want there to be a point later on where anyone says, you said you were holding class size harmless at high school, because what we said was we're allocating based on ratio. And that's how those two things are different. In middle school, the average of the core is 30 students. And in title, it's a little bit lower. It's about 28. And phys ed is a big number. In middle school, we're looking at phys ed numbers that could be in the 40 to 44 range. So that is an important part of this story. When we reduce at this level, and we have almost all of our people in schools, when we're faced with constraints like this, there is almost no way to not impact the classroom. 40% of the reductions we didn't touch it. We did everything first. And then we still had millions to cut. When we say this is an excruciating budget, this is what we mean. Okay. I'm next going to go on to page 47. We're now into the next chunk, which is the general fund. So that's tab 100. And then 47, we want to just show you these pie charts. There's a couple areas that these are both easy to read and commonly misunderstood. So on the left, what you've got is general fund resources. And I want to point out to you the beginning fund balance portion of this pie. A common misunderstanding that I'm encountering is people thinking that the beginning fund balance is the same as the money we get every year. But it actually isn't. It's a pull-out, one-time piece. And if we spend it, it's gone. The only money we get every year is the money the state gives us every year. So hold that concept in your mind as you move over to the next graph. You'll see that 81% of our general fund expenditures are people. but that is 81%, including the beginning fund balance. If we're just asking the question, how are we spending the money we get every year? If we exclude the savings, 93% of our general fund is people. And you can feel that in these reductions because we tried to protect people, so we cut everything else. But that means that our gen fund is now stuffed to the brim with people. It means that if we don't see a change in the next biennium, and we leave big gaps, and we have big personnel increases, we are going to be having this conversation again. Because the only thing that can happen with people is they become more expensive. Okay. My last, well, actually I had two, but we already covered it thanks to the transfer question. So that was going over the transfers. I would like to take you guys to 144 for a second, which I guess technically bumps us into the next tab. Ooh, several tabs forward. We're going to go to 144 because I want you to see preventative and deferred maintenance. I'm going to ask for help from Sarah. I think you know this, or Bob if you're watching. I believe what I was recently told is that our bond is 97% spent or encumbered. That is a really important funding source for us for facilities. Preventative and deferred maintenance becomes an even more important fund for us in the absence of capital funding or heavily obligated capital funding, because if something happens in our building, we have to have a place to go. Dr. Chandragiri, this is somewhat related to your question earlier about how do we live frugally, but not so frugally that we put ourselves at risk. If we have an HVAC system go out, if we have a major ice storm, we have to know that we can repair our schools. And so what you'll see here is us continuing to invest in this because we cannot be in a situation where we can't repair our schools. And with a bond that's nearly exhausted, this becomes our most important funding source for things like that. I think I have good news for the committee.
Chair, I have a quick question.
That's the end of my plan, and so I turn it over to you.
Catherine?
Thank you. So I do have a quick question on the bond. And I just want to make sure it's healthy so it's not threatening next, this budget for the 24-25 school year. Because we passed the bond, I'm thinking 2018 for all those facility improvements. And 2020 did a number on construction and inflation. And so I just want to double check that, I didn't see an assumption in the budget that we would have a risk of overrunning those bonds for any sort of construction project. So making sure those construction budgets are healthy and then they're not going to bleed into any general fund obligations next year.
Our construction team is fabulous, and they've been watching it, and we actually had a list of things that we got to circle back in schools, so I don't have any concerns there.
Okay.
As one of the co-chairs of the Bond Oversight Committee, I would say that is absolutely true.
And I would echo that. It's been
I
incredible.
would say on the issue of preventive and deferred maintenance, if you remember historically, maybe I'm the only person in the room who will remember this, but when we went out for the bond in 2008, it was a huge issue with our Chamber of Commerce that we had let our buildings go as we made reductions, and that there was a commitment made that we would never be in a place again where we just took all the money out of deferred maintenance. That 2008 bond, half of it was spent to make our buildings safe and secure again. So that's an important piece of history. So thanks for indulging me on that. So you're at the end of your questions, your presentation, and it appears we're at the end of our questions, or Ashley, you look like you have one.
I just have one minor, I think, technical question. As we were talking about the ending fund balance and the policy around how much the target is, and in our budget last year, it refers to the same policy and it says between 5% and 7%. And that's what I'm finding on other documentation, but then there's other financial reports that say between 7% and 12%, and then this budget between 7% and 12%. And I can't locate the policy. It's not our policy, it's a district policy. So I just wondered, what is the official recommendation in the ADM 001 financial management say?
I don't remember the exact date, but it was updated by the board as they were watching things. And I believe by the time this last year's budget book went to print, it should have read the higher number, not the 5 to 7 anymore. So my apologies.
Okay, so the board updated it. Okay, thank you.
I will also say that in those years where we were cutting and cutting and cutting, I believe there was a year that we went under that amount. It was very difficult, and those were years where we walked through the year waiting for those revenue updates, and they were declining. So it was an additive issue in those years.
Chair, can I ask a question?
Satya?
I'm just following up on Dr. Strawn's question of a healthy, what do you say, end fund balance, how do you get there? So moving forward, if we were all going to sit and advocate with our legislators, what should be the number that we should be asking? Because the state hasn't done any costing study for adequacy or equity. They're using current service model as a way to simply keep repeating the numbers. So what should we be asking so that we have a healthy cushion, maybe if not in the next 2 years or 4 years, otherwise we're just kicking the can down the lane.
Can I clarify that you're asking about what we should be asking for if we were to be funded adequately?
Correct. Because, we are all, at least seem to agree that the state hasn't, that there is a role for state to adequately fund. But then what should be the number so that we can decide saying we need a healthy end fund balance rather than going through the same story 2 years from now?
I personally do not know what that number is for us, because it's based on not just financial analysis, but also a series of philosophical questions and practical questions about what schools do and should do. And I imagine if we had 10 people in the room who are expert in this, they would all come up with different answers to the philosophical and conceptual questions, and that would produce different numbers. I can tell you in extremely round numbers that the level of debate that exists between the organizations that represent school administrators and school business officers and the organizations that calculate current service level, the gap in between is what they call the $1 billion difference of opinion. And that isn't even about adequacy. That's just the method to determine how much schools as they currently exist cost. $1 billion statewide delta, just to calculate how much they actually cost now. If there were an additional $1 billion, I think that we would have a much more vibrant and happy budget committee session in 12 months than the one that we're having right now.
The reason is board has certain goals. That's how we went with the assumption that board goals. Of course, the state's costing doesn't take into consideration our board goal. And currently, I'm not even sure on what outcome they are looking for when they're doing their costing, or they have done what few years ago. So how can we go and what should we be advocating for other than saying fund adequately for what outcome?
I think that you're asking a question of strategy now.
I am.
Reasonable minds disagree on the question of strategy. I will just share mine. In one of my previous roles, I worked at the State Department of Education and for a governor, and we did funding reform. Like, tore the funding formula down to studs and rebuilt the whole thing. And it is a wildly, ridiculously ambitious political project. Because it requires one of two things. Either a consensus among policymakers that they're going to fund it to the level that the new formula demands, or an agreement amongst many people who tend to not agree that some districts are going to be losers and some districts are going to be winners, or a blend of the two. It is not my initial instinct that the conditions exist in Oregon right now to take on a project of that magnitude. But there is a knowable number about the difference between what it actually costs to run the schools we have right now and what the state is giving us. And if that's got $1 billion range on it, I think that is a worthy pursuit and an excellent way to start an organized agenda.
Okay, Chrissy, thank you so much. So I know we've discussed the request for the entry of that conversation for a long time, and so I appreciate that outlook. So I was kind of curious. I mean, there's a whole bunch of different little questions I could take with that somewhat concept without the whole reconstruction. Talking about the pyramid upside down, classroom down. What, as of today, would the finances look like to require to sustain that? Our favorite numbers for students, per teacher ratio, for example. But then also what then we are asking the representatives and such just to please look at passing bills in general that would allow any sort of fund, like we're taking donations almost, hey, $10 here, 100 here, or what does that question and that presentation look like? Sorry I didn't mean to make comedy of it, but I hope that was clear enough in my question, for example. Thank you.
It is, I want to offer one kind of process issue. We don't have Rebecca Jacobson with us, but we did seek her counsel on the degree to which this body can pursue issues of advocacy around formula change or anything related to that. And her response is, the statutory purpose of this committee is pretty well defined, and it is about the discussion, review, possible revision, and adoption of budgets. So I'm going to answer this, but I also am just kind of going to look at our chairperson to make sure we don't stumble into something that maybe we shouldn't be in tonight. I think your question was, part of it was, what would it cost to fund to what we think are optimum levels? Was that the first part of your question?
Sure, yeah, just the scope of classrooms in general, one little piece of it. Yes.
Well, classrooms
You
will be
said
the
$1 billion.
majority of us, so.
Right.
I think if you go to page 18 in your budget book, these are not our optimums, but since there's no other publication of optimums in this budget book, and it is the thoughtful consideration of our association, let's look at this page. What I would encourage you to do is just kind of, even though this is class size and the other one is ratio, you can kind of flip back and forth and just visually scan the differences. I have no idea what it would cost to staff to these ratios, or these class sizes, but I think it is fair to say it could come close to doubling our personnel budget.
Okay, so I have two little questions of that. One I'm going to toss out there, which you can say is later too, just because I don't know. So we've talked about what we can do as a board to bring up this topic to help change and help the flow of that. So I know there's been a request, and it's been denied multiple times. But if we can help, if it's determined per our budget meeting, if that's a piece that we as a board can help to bring forth and pass to, I'd like to maybe continue with that discussion at some point if we can't right now. Thank you.
As would I.
Thanks.
And that sounds like a topic for another day. So, any other questions before we move to public testimony? Catherine?
Nancy, I'm sorry. I just have one, and I just, again, Sarah, I went through this, and I didn't see it, but I have to ask, because I know it's a large cost soak for a lot of government agencies is contracting. So contracts going to any staff augmentation or, just, hey, we got to write a report, sometimes they contract that out. Is there any part of the budget book where I could see that? I looked for it, didn't see it. So,
In ours, it would all be by function. For
Okay.
example, special education contracts some different services, and so it's going to show up in the objects for contracts within those functions, 1220 and 1250.
Okay.
Does that help you? So there won't
Yeah.
be one section that says these are contracts. They would all be in the different functions.
Okay. So Nancy, maybe it's something to put on our list of things to further research is just contracts, the spend on those contracts and purpose.
Any other questions? Satya?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I mean, at some stage, if there is a clarification of, when the revenue comes in, we base it on weightage for different categories, and in Oregon, you can weight up to 2 of them. But when it comes to expenses part of the budget, it's very hard for me to track if the dollar follows the child, or we kind of mix everything in a bucket, and then there's a percentage we spend. So the expense part necessarily don't follow the revenue coming in. So that has been historically the limitation. So is there some kind of explanation you can help us understand, even if it is like, say, EL students, 86 or 85% of the expenses go towards educating an EL student or something like that. So we can understand from an equity point of view, are the dollars completely following? When it's a restricted fund, it's a little bit easier to understand, but when we are mixing all this, it becomes a little hard for me to understand.
I think maybe that goes into the question category for later. I'll also add the approach that you're describing, and also to a certain degree, Catherine, the idea of funding the classroom first, these in some ways kind of intersect. It's called student-based budgeting. It's actually a pretty well-established way to resource schools. In effect, that's what happens when the state gives the money to us. They do it by enrollment. So there is a method inside of that. What is very unusual, but done in some systems, is student-based allocation methods inside the district. We do not have that method here. It takes, I would say, honestly, conservatively, a decade to get student-based budgeting on its feet, because you roll it out in small increments. You can't just go to it. The transition is too jarring. If you imagine you're a small elementary school and maybe you've been unknowingly subsidized through the staffing method, and then all of a sudden you switch over to student-based budgeting and you only have 340 kids, you could see your funding go down at a level that you couldn't even run your school. So it takes 10 years to get there. Many, many thoughtful, connected steps. I add that story because I don't know that we have the internal data infrastructure to answer your question with the precision we would like. There might be versions that we can back into, but in the absence of a student-based budgeting accounting method, an allocation method, it's very difficult to shoehorn your way into that kind of information.
Thank
Maria?
I just wanted to ask kind of like a clarifying point to Satya's question, is that we have this, the state funding model allocates certain weights depending on like student needs and whatnot, English language learners, IEPs, teen parent programs, et cetera. I guess just to clarify for everyone, do those overlap? Because we know that like we have a district that, you know, you're not just in ELL or you're not just on IEPs and so on and so forth.
I'm still learning about the state funding formula, but what I believe to be true, and I'm gonna actually look to Suzanne on this, what I believe to be true is that you're funded for a maximum of 2 weights. So you could be a young person who qualifies under multiple categories. Let's say you are, you have an IEP, you're an English language learner, and you're a preschooler. Well, that would be unlikely. You are a teen parent. You qualify for 2, not all of them. And I'm gonna actually turn it over to Suzanne to add any more to that.
That's entirely accurate. 2 is the maximum weight.
What this means, I believe, in a system like ours, where we have a lot of complex, stacked need, is that it is yet another way that we're systematically underfunded. If the need is more stretched out, more isolated, more dispersed, then 2 of 3 might be less of a hardship. But what I believe it means is that our, the 0.25 weight for poverty is getting systematically dropped from our formula because we have a lot of kids who are already grabbing the other 2. Yet they still are qualifying and living in conditions that qualify for a poverty weight. It's just the revenue doesn't travel with them.
Public testimony.
Chair, can we take a break, 2 minutes, bio break?
We only have 5 people speaking, and we'll take a break as soon as the public testimony's over, if that would be okay.
Yes.
I feel your pain. Now is time for the public comment portion of the District Budget Committee meeting. Please note that typically we select speakers at random, but tonight 5 people signed up and all 5 will be speaking. We provided an opportunity for public comment by call-in, Zoom, in person, and in writing, and have allotted 30 minutes to hear comment. And tonight we will hear people both in person and on Zoom. Each participant has 3 minutes. Electronic mechanisms are used for translation. We have a countdown timer on the screen for monitoring time. The timer counts down from 3 minutes. At 30 seconds, it turns from green to yellow. At 1 second, it turns red and plays a short bell to signal time is up. It will be my job at that point to ask the speaker to stop. Please be mindful of your pace for our interpreters. If the board receives written comment, and it's my understanding that there was no written comment. Is that accurate? Correct. So the first person to speak is Brian Zauber-Reed, and he is here in person.
Oh my goodness. Do I have to hit the button or? Nope, we're good? Oh, awesome. Good evening, everyone. All right, school board members, superintendent, esteemed community members, and budget committee. I'm here today to underscore the profound impact of individuals who are often the unsung heroes of our education system. These individuals are the backbone of our schools, the ones who ensure that our children not only reach their classrooms, but they also thrive with them. Think about our dedicated bus drivers. Without them, who would get the students to school? They're the friendly faces that the children see in the morning and the last as they're going home. And then there are the teachers, the heart of the education system. These are the ones who guide our students, impacting knowledge, who are imparting knowledge and wisdom and helping them grow. Let's not forget the instructional assistants, the special instructional assistants in our SPED and in self-contained classrooms. They provide invaluable support both inside and outside the class, ensuring that every student needs are met. Our graduation coaches play a pivotal role in the lives of the high school students who are there struggling to provide the extra guidance and support needed to help the students cross the finish line and achieve their dreams. As a parent and a proud employee of our district, I chose this community not because of the upper administrators, although they're pretty cool, but because of the dedicated individuals and many more that work tirelessly to support our children in our schools. But it's not just about recognizing their importance, it's about involving our entire community in this budget cut conversations. Our schools are not just buildings, they're communities within larger communities. As such, we must play a role in supporting and uplifting them. Let us continue to prioritize the well-being and support of our students-facing staff, ensuring that they are the priority and have the resources they need to succeed. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Next up is Chana Saikoski, also in person. Forgive me if I massacred that.
Hello, my name is Chana Saikoski. I have been a library media assistant with the district since 2005. For the first 6 years, I was the assistant to a teacher librarian. In 2011, all elementary and middle school librarians were laid off. As library media assistants, we took over management of the libraries. While this position may seem like a small portion of district employees, it is an important one, and we often feel overlooked. It is practice in our district for teacher preps to be covered by PE, music, and library teachers. When the teacher librarians were laid off, we began doing the job of 2 people, with some duties being that of a teacher at the pay rate of a classified employee. Our FTE is determined by enrollment, so many of us don't even have full-time hours. It is the responsibility of each principal to decide how the library media assistant is utilized. In addition to the numerous library responsibilities, most of us are assigned other duties throughout the school. Over recent years, additional responsibilities have been shifted to library media assistants. Chromebook circulation is managed in the same system as library books, so many library assistants are responsible for checking in and out every student Chromebook each year, as well as regular maintenance for them. It is very time-consuming. Among the current cuts, Library Media Support Services is anticipating significant staff loss. Due to this shortage, library book cataloging, which has always been done by Library Media Services, will be shifted to Library Media Assistants. Library Media Services is doing all they can to make this as seamless as possible, but we get hundreds of new books each year, so this will take time. In the new teacher contract, they received more prep time, which they desperately need. I don't think there was an appropriate plan established for how these preps would be covered. Many of our fellow library media assistants have been informed that they will likely cover some, if not all, of those preps. We would not only need time to have these students with us, but we would also need time to prepare for them. We are in a position that keeps getting extra things assigned to us, and most of us feel like we already don't have time to do all that our job requires. It is not uncommon for us to work through our breaks and our lunchtime. Many of us work late during the week and on weekends and still don't get all the library things done. How are we supposed to take on those extra classes? I have been in my library for 19 years, and there are so many things I love about being in this position. Lately, I have been feeling like I need to consider looking for something different. It breaks my heart to think about the possibility of leaving my students and my library, but how much more can I take on? We request that someone please consider how much is asked of library media assistants. Consider an updated title. Consider giving us full-time status despite our enrollment. Consider some sort of new classification. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Next is Lisa Olson, also in person.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Lisa Olson. I work as a library media specialist at Chapman Hill Elementary School, and I have been in this position since December of 2016. In my heart, I believe if students hate coming to the library, they will never love reading. I am here to represent the 42 elementary school library media personnel and to share with you how the RIF and the new teacher contract is going to impact our positions, students, and elementary schools significantly. In 2011, this district did away with teacher librarians in both our elementary and middle schools through the RIF process. As of today, library media personnel are working under a position description that is dated June of 2009, and our classification title is Library Media Assistant. Let me be clear, we are not an assistant to anyone. The district has left a single classified person to manage everything associated with library duties, and also the sole person responsible to take an entire classroom while a teacher is on their prep.
Can I ask you to slow down just a bit so that the translators can keep up?
I will try my best. You need to know we do not have time to do the essential functions of our job description already. Most library media personnel give an additional 5 to 10 hours of their time outside of student contact hours to do the essential duties. This is why we want you to hear and know the biggest changes that are about to happen with library media. Teachers will be getting more preps under our new contract, so the administration is solving their scheduling problem by shifting these classes to the library. Many of us have already been told by our administration that we will be taking anywhere from 8 to 12 more classes per week this coming next school year. By pushing this additional prep time coverage to library media personnel, we will now have as many classes as the teacher librarian, library media assistant, and computer lab teacher combined prior to 2011. Library Media Services is the district's central office where textbooks and new materials are put into our library database, cataloged, and barcoded for each school. They have been identified in the current RIF cuts and will be losing several of their staff. Somewhere within the district, it has been determined that their duties will be shifted out to the school libraries. This will require our district to purchase essential equipment and supplies for all 42 schools to make this happen. In recent years, TIS had made a change from PCs to Chromebooks and determined that library media will be in charge of Chromebook oversight within the school. If at any time a Chromebook has a functional issue, teachers send students to the library to make us fix the Chromebooks. Imagine the disruption of this during library classes. It truly feels like no one in the district level, school board, or union is paying attention. Decisions are being made without district communication from one department to another, and no one is looking out for library media personnel. When and where do the extra essential duties stop? Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Next up is Kimberly Reed-Zauber, also in person.
Good evening, Salem-Keizer School Board student representatives, budget committee members, superintendent and cabinet directors, in person and virtual. I'm Kimberly Reed-Zauber, she, her. I'm a proud union worker at Parish Middle School, and I'm speaking as an individual. I'm not here to offer any input. It's too late for that, probably has been for quite some time. What I really want right now are some answers. Not so much about our immediate situation, but about indicators or symptoms of our long-term budget priorities. The education community has raised quite a number of questions since last April. Questions that are specific to our current leadership and predicament, but can be considered as indicators of our overall budgeting priorities. These questions really have not been addressed. I know that you can't respond to public comment during these meetings, so I'm just asking for a published response to some questions here. Response considered as indicators of Salem-Keizer's spending priorities. What is the rationale behind the 10 to 27% raises for our cabinet level directors? And will you all be taking your pay freezes again next year? Why are we maintaining so many of the expenditures taken on with temporary ESSER funding when that funding is no longer here? Why has our central administration continued to increase since our student enrollment began to decline? What is the rationale behind removing school positions working with students rather than rolling back some or all of the aforementioned increase? Why do we pay for outside consulting and other contracting with such a vast array of knowledge and experience in our own staff? Why are school-based staff who know and understand the needs not involved in the real spending decisions? Why are our schools in low-income, largely BIPOC communities in such bad shape? Why are we spending money on weapon detectors rather than on staffing and programs that will keep students safe and address their social, emotional, and academic needs? And really, when will we see an end to the top-heavy spending? Those are my questions. Thank you for your attention this evening, and I'll look forward to reading those answers.
Thank you. The last person with public testimony is Jane Tichenal and is on Zoom.
She is here.
And we see her.
Hi there. Can you see me?
Yes.
Okay.
And hear
Great,
you.
Thank you. Great. Thank you. Thanks for your time tonight. This message is to the parents of this community and to the state legislators and leaders of Oregon. We are not facing a crisis in education, we are in one. My time here is not to scare or to catastrophize. However, this is an urgent message I hope you will choose to consider. I encourage you to see this issue in two ways. As a single parent to a teenage boy, I can empathize with many of you how difficult the last few years have been. It's been the most important challenge of my life, but one that has at times felt debilitating to handle. I've heard so many stories from so many other parents about the unimaginable situations they have found themselves in with their child, wondering what to do next, how can they help their child, what will their future hold based on the reality of their lives right now. Not only is our nation facing a historical moment, so is our city. All over our neighborhoods, we are facing heartbreaking tragedies and reductions, sometimes even wondering how we will survive. Can you imagine life getting harder? The reality is it absolutely will. With our district cutting $71 million and 400 teaching positions, our students are facing a grim reality, one that will have a direct impact on your family and mine every day. I believe youth violence will inevitably increase, especially if we have even less qualified and prepared staff to supervise the physical and social emotional needs of students. Families will face greater challenges, students will face more permanent consequences, and our community will be responsible for the financial and social burden this will cause. Prioritizing education is a matter of life or death for some, and at the very least, a bittersweet experience living here in Salem-Keizer. Oregon is facing a time where we are seeing the impact of our choices, both past and present. We are seeing the teacher retention rate plummet and less parents available to parent well. If we don't have people joining the teacher workforce or willing parents to help, who will teach our kids how to read, how to write, how to comprehend? These skills are vital to raising capable and confident kids who will grow up to be responsible members and leaders of the city. The future of democracy lies with the children we are raising right now. When they grow up, they will be the ones to govern the city, to write policy, and hopefully create impactful change. State leaders, community members, and parents, we must do our part to ensure the future our kids will someday live in without us will continue to be a safe and sustainable home. Education is the most important and sacred space in our society. Parents and community members, we must loudly advocate to our state legislators that education should be their #1 priority, to fund schools equitably, to remind them our kids and teachers deserve quality, accessible, and safe education. And finally, we must choose to be caregivers who will educate ourselves and take action. Just as we've recently witnessed young people rising up for what's right, demanding change, I hope to be like them someday. Thank you.
Thank you. With that testimony, we're going to take a 10-minute break. It is 8 o'clock. Please come back at 8:10. and then we will have opportunity to discuss the budget. Have a mic. I know. I have that one. Amount unspent on contract. Yeah, so this, are you coming back, please? Thank you. While people are getting their seats, I just want to acknowledge the public testimony and just summarize the things that I heard. I very much appreciated the first speaker who put a face on the many people who impact the students in our district, and I thought that was a really important thing at this moment. There were 2 people who testified about the increasing workload on the library media assistants, and one of the most difficult things I ever did on the board was participate in that decision to lose our librarians. So I think what you said about your workload was heard. Someone presented a whole list of questions about transparency, most of which I wrote down, and the parent who was really pushing for advocacy from to our parents to be advocating to legislators. And I think we all have to come together on that in a different venue. So we are now, I'm going to open the floor for any committee discussion regarding the proposed budget. So we were asking very specific questions before, so now is the time to discuss. And I also have to say, I know it is the norm, the culture of the board now to call each other director this and director that. When I served on the board, we used first names, and I just have, my whole life, had trouble with calling people by their last names. So I'm calling you by your first names, and if you're offended, I'm sorry. Maria.
Well, I do want to acknowledge that you just said that you wanted to kind of like pull back to a little bit more of a broader discussion. But, you know, as it so happens is that, you know, we have time and we get to look at things more often. I was wondering maybe in our general fund, and I mean, this like line item pops up multiple times for communication, and I was just wondering maybe like what we could anticipate are in those items. So like I'm looking at page 51, for example, elementary instruction, then we've got purchase services, 350 communication. And we've got that come up a few times, you know, like in middle school and high school, and so I was just wondering if there's an answer. If it has to come back to it later, that's totally fine.
You said 150?
Yeah, on page 51.
Oh, 51.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I, like, you know, it's a line item that occurs in multiple different buckets.
Yes, thank you.
So the object for communication includes telephone, postage, advertising, printing and binding, and then other communication services.
Okay.
Can you restate that, please? Sorry, it was a little hard to hear. Wasn't loud enough. Okay, so the communication object includes telephone, postage, advertising, printing and binding, and other communication services. Per the ODE manual, it's a little weird for communication.
Sarah, can I ask a clarifying follow-up on that? So we're looking at page 51, where we happen to be under elementary instruction. Given that clarification, I just want to confirm that this is not where you would find district communication services. These are specific to the level.
Many people code the things though, so, I mean, we'd have to look to see specifically what they're putting in there. But elementary schools print a lot.
Certainly.
The parent communication, like the parent view and whatnot, is that encompassed in this? No, okay.
I just want to bring us back to when you're asking questions like this, the point is just to understand better what's in the different pieces of the budget, or if they're leading you to say, I'm concerned about. So I guess it would be helpful to me if you say, I'm asking this question because I've always wondered what we spend that money on, versus I see this as a place where we could make an alteration or something like that.
Well, as, to your point, like, I was wondering, like, what sits in there. And I mean, I am just a volunteer, and I don't have the time dedicated the way that our district staff does to focus on this budget. But it was one of those places where I was looking and seeing, like, what if we didn't print as much stuff? But again, I'm just a volunteer, and I don't necessarily think that I would feel comfortable, like, outright saying, oh, I just learned about this line item, could we slash it or something like that?
Thank you, that's helpful for me. Other,
Can I add one quick thing to that?
you may.
Thank you. If you go to page 22 of your budget book, you'll see budget assumptions. And this doesn't specifically get to the details of elementary communication, but if you look at the third bullet from the bottom, supplies and materials in most departments, and to the degree that it was reasonable, that included schools, were already reduced by 10%. So we did actually go kind of level by level and make the cuts that we felt that we could, and minimize the cuts to schools to the maximum degree possible by absorbing those reductions at department levels.
Other comments about the budget as a whole? I'm not seeing any. So I have written down 2 questions that were raised that I said we'd circle back to. One was positions in administration defined. And the second was money spent on contracts. And I guess the first piece of that is to ask if those are the kinds of things that rise to the level of workload for the district that we need a vote in order to ask the district to put the resources into finding answers to those.
I think I can help a little more with the first one, but I want to clarify what I believe I heard you ask for, make sure we have the terms of it right. I think what I heard you ask for is a listing of every single administrative title that falls into that group of 191, and a couple of sentences about what they all do.
Yes. Yeah, so if you want to group them by title, I'm okay with that. I don't know if anybody.
That's what I would like.
Yeah.
That's what
But yeah, just kind of what the objective of their positions are and how many are in that grouping and that title.
So I would think that you would say elementary principals, X, and this is what they do. And, you know, the principals and assistant principals and athletic directors and those kinds of things will be easy, but then there's a lot that we're like, who are those people?
Great.
That is not a time-consuming project for us. So yes, we can do that. I'm not sure that it rises to the level of needing a vote according to the procedure. Does it seem acceptable that we leave off principals and assistant principals?
They're within the 191, is that right?
They are in the 191. I'm not sure what your goal is, so I'm just trying to get the footprint as small as
I would
possible.
just think you would say there are X elementary principals. There are X middle school principals, not at Leslie Middle School, there's 3 people. At Parrish, there's 4 people.
Okay.
Not that.
That's a helpful clarification.
But just,
Total numbers.
yeah.
Okay. The other thing that I think would be helpful for us, but also for anyone who's watching, is to understand more about your intent. And the reason I say this is that for good or ill, what people will hear in this, what some people will hear, is a possible intent to line item excise administrators. And that's because we're in a state that's anxious right now. And so I think maybe just hearing from you a little bit more about this as a matter of curiosity will just help people understand more about how to interpret this, if they're even listening.
Yeah, okay. It is a matter of curiosity, and I think that, you know, just with any budget, 93% or 80% is in staffing. Part of that is admin, and that's not directly in the classroom. And so just a clearer understanding of what those 191 do. It's just a matter of curiosity. It's not a matter to line item budget cut. It's to understand the level of administration needed for the school to operate.
I don't think we need a vote on that. I think we can do that relatively easily.
I think it's also in response, in some respects, to things that we're hearing in the community. And so for us to be able to understand, you know, what it is people do.
It's almost the number one question that get asked. And so I'm just going to drop my personal opinion here. I feel like a vague response to that. My question since July was just out of curiosity because I would like to understand what I signed up for, like have a vague scope of what the district is as a whole. But nowadays, it's, I literally don't know how to answer the question when folks ask me about admin and stuff. And I think that it would be healthier to reveal just that easy bit to be able to have that discussion and at least appear more transparent and just open. And yes, we're here, we care about you, to talk about it. What does a school look like? Somebody asked me just last week again, how many admin do you have? Well, geez, I don't know. And I'm like, well, I think we have a principal, we have this and that. And I'm thinking of elementary, middle, high. But then elementary is easiest for me, but then I lose it as the higher. So it would just be able to allow me anyway, I should speak for myself, to have a simple conversation with any one community member that is asking stuff like that a lot. Does that make sense? Nothing super deep and crazy, not incriminating, I feel like. I just don't want to be offensive. Thank you.
And we'll say very publicly, certainly not with the intent to draw lines. The other question that I heard raised tonight is the amount of money spent on contracts. And is that something that needs a vote, or is that, and I guess it would be important to hear what the intent of that was before we even discuss the second portion of it.
Sure. The intent, again, is just curiosity. I do know that whenever state agencies go through budget cuts, you know, you look at your asset management plan, you look at your contracts, because so often, you know, oh, we got to write a report, we don't have the staff on hand, let's just contract that out. And these things tend to grow over time, and they can become quite pricey. So, so understanding of the contracts and what we have open and what their intent is, I think would be helpful. Again, we're just really at this point, I mean, I can state my intent is looking for budget dust. Like, a lot of the work's been done. I don't want to derail a lot of the work, but I also want to tell my kids and their teachers that I'm doing my best to really understand everything that goes into this budget. And I do know when it comes to governments, a lot of money is spent on contracting out jobs, staff augmentation, and stuff like that. So I just want to do my due diligence and making sure that we're looking at those contracts.
So I think this one, the answer of whether or not this is a significant amount of time really depends on how broadly or narrowly we define a contract. So, you know, you had talked about staff augmentation. That's actually a pretty narrow definition. We could do that, I think, relatively easily. If it's literally just staffing that we bring in on a contract basis to supplement our workforce. There were other versions, though, like, let's say you said, no, we want every contract. Well, I mean, that could be vision and all sorts of things. That would be a huge project because it's more of a drift net than it is line fishing. So if it's just staff augmentation, I'm going to defer to Sarah and ask her to weigh in on what it would take to pull that kind of data.
Off the top of my head, all that stuff has to be approved by HR so that it complies with our CBAs. And so my first thought is special ed services, those two functions I talked about before.
Okay.
So I don't think that would be terrible to pull. And we typically write our contracts for annual, so then everything gets reviewed every year. We don't do, in this area, a lot of blanket or multi-year kind of things.
Okay. Yeah, so, sorry, Chair Nancy.
Go ahead.
Okay, so staff augmentation, but I'm really, like, I don't need the janitor contracts and the, you know, we order our light bulbs from, you know, that kind of stuff. But if there's any, like, team building, you know, just kind of, I don't know how to classify those type of contracts, but, you know, staff aren't getting along, so we bring in some experts to, you know, do staff team building, or we augment, you know, we got to write a report to ODE, let's contract out the visual dynamic, like those kind of things can save money. So Sarah, I don't know what to call those contracts. And they could be in this 30 million, you know, when you guys were going through, I mean, that would be a really good place to start cutting is those type of contracts. But, so they could already be out of the budget, but they're a little hard to track in the line items. But I don't know if that added any more clarification, but I'm looking for kind of that, yeah, your janitors and that kind of stuff I'm not so much looking at, but it's the, you know, the design services, supplemental services, I think would be.
I want to be really careful on record, too, to say that our custodial staff are our employees covered by our CBA, so I don't want anyone to leave this meeting or be confused about that.
Okay.
I was going to just say the same thing.
Sorry, just any contracts where it's just like, of course you need that to run a, you know, run a school.
Bus drivers as well.
Yeah.
Are people that in other districts are contracted and they are not contracted in this district.
So categories of, broad strokes, categories of exclusion are services required to run schools. So, you know, for example, we have all of our meal services under contract. I think there are 3 employees responsible for feeding 2 meals a day to 40,000 kids. We could exclude things like that.
Right.
There are other categories of contracted services that are very specific services for students with disabilities. Those might be, you know, different kinds of specialized, you know, therapeutic services.
Yeah.
Exclude those, because
Exclude
that
the
will be
special ed,
amongst the
yeah.
more complicated
Right.
ones. I think what I'm hearing you say is things that we might reasonably call elective. How big is that number? How big is the number for, you know, for example, we have contracts with university partners to support teacher pipelines. Is that the kind of stuff you want? Half the time we'll be figuring out what you want. That's,
I know, and I'm
that's where this is tricky, because you're asking us to find the needle, and we're looking at the haystack. I think we could take a swing at it if you'll give us the latitude to interpret what you're looking in a way that is responsive, but cuts off large portions of things that are going to be enormously time-consuming to pull.
Right. Yeah, if you're a state agency, this would be a lot easier. But I don't know what kind of special contracts like schools get into and what they tend to contract out. So, but yeah, one-time elective contracts would be helpful.
Would it be helpful to get clarity? Sorry, if I may. Would it be helpful to get clarity on the types of contracts that we enter before diving into the numbers? Because I feel like working in state, like I hear what you're saying right around the different kinds of contracts, but it sounds like there's, I don't know. That's the question.
Yeah, that's a great first step, I think, is the type of contracts we get into. Be helpful. And then we'll look at that and see.
I have Kelly and then Satya and then Chrissy.
If it's not been asked.
First, I want to say on the record that my assumption is that capable people built this and did it with the best of intentions. And so I mean, I may not have even known to ask about something as nuanced as the contracts coming into the meeting tonight. So I want to just say that I would like to know more about where a lot of money is or isn't going, and for edifying reasons. I do not want to line item swipe anything if we can avoid it. I don't think that's at all the goal. So for me, it's about edification and understanding the budget. And I was wondering, Director Guzman just sort of said what I was thinking, which is, can we talk about these in categories? Maybe even here's the 10 largest categories, and or some. That's my thinking about what would be useful. But I'm not a professional, at least not in this area. So if that's a possibility that saves time, I'd be really curious just to understand, because there's going to be a tension on two sides here. Like the contracts nominally might be saving money, not costing money, right?
Yeah.
But that then means that the associations aren't getting those employees into the association. So I understand there's also that tension going on here as well. So I'm just being able to see them and understand categorically what kinds of contracts and how big they are, I think would be, and how many people are employed under them, that sort of. And if that's really hard to do, then I think I may not think it was that important. Again, on the assumption that people have already looked at that. But if it's accessible, I think it would be really useful.
I think we can get to a point that you feel like you've got some visibility. Again, I just think we're going to need to make some judgment calls without conferring with the committee about how to shape the visibility, knowing that what you want is to be able to see in broad strokes where, if significant amounts of money are going to contract a service of any sort that is outside of school operations or direct services to schools, where and how much. And I don't know what number feels big to you, so I'm not going to speculate about that. I will say that less than any school system I've been involved with, this school system does less contracting than any I've been involved with. In our last school system, we ran multi-million-dollar consulting contracts year over year with teacher development programs, teacher training programs, curriculum providers. This is not a system that relies on consultants. And that is, it's honestly a really fortunate thing right now, because when you rely on them and you have to cut them, it tears a big hole into your capacity. So the number may look big to you, but I can tell you by comparison, I will, even without looking at it, know that I will think it is an extremely humble number. And then similarly with staff augmentation, most of the people are ours. And I believe that that's largely what you'll see. So on this one, I'm going to defer to Sarah and Suzanne on whether or not this is sizing this up and bringing something is at a level that we should take a vote or at a level we should just take on.
I recommend, to your direct question, that we take a vote. I do want to offer a clarification to the committee, if I may. Just to be really clear and to augment what you heard previously is that we have a stipulation in our contracts with our classified association that we will not contract services without direct consultation with them. So we do not contract many services outside of those individuals who work directly for us and with us.
Satya and Chrissy both had comments. Do you have comments about whether or not we take a vote?
This comment was about, just to clarify a little piece, what Catherine asked about the contract.
Okay, go ahead.
May I? Thank you, Chair. You know, when there was, at least there is some public perception that if there are some internal expertise, and are we still, is it? Oh, sorry. If there is expertise within our district, and if there is also contracting for similar services, that was not clear based on the public comment. Are we having consultants come here, which could have been handled by internal expertise of our staff? If that is the case, I would at least like to know, because that would be one way to think in terms of a lean operation and save some money. But that doesn't mean we need to cut. That could also mean that we need it, maybe not at a scale that is available internally. So, but at least the community, if they understand, yes, we are contracting for consultants, which we do have expertise, but not enough to support at a scale that is needed. That way it'll at least rest their case. Otherwise, I keep hearing this. Why are we bringing so many consultants? Why are we bringing people who are retired back as a consultant when we do have good teachers and staff who can do the same thing?
Chrissy?
If we were to pursue it at that scope, it will swamp our team. I just want to be clear about that, because then it's not pulling the data grouped. Then it is a pretty significant editorial project on each one, justifying it as an expenditure. So I hear where you're coming from on it. I just want to caution us that that probably doubles or triples the amount of work.
Chrissy?
Mine might be little. When you'd made the comment that we go annually, that's nice. I like the conversation that we're able to have to kind of just discuss things, because it's not, they're just simple questions, I feel. So annually, that's one piece, one answer. And another thing might just be, well, overall, without going too deep, if we vote to pass whichever and do, say, 10 largest or whatever it is, what did we spend bottom line on budget this year, last year, and so on, kind of backing what Kelly, and we've had some discussion tonight as well, thinking about the future several years down the road and kind of what that scale looks like. But as far as if you had said, and I don't know what you meant exactly by this, Sarah, but looking at it every year, it sounds like, and you probably we wouldn't be skimming it, but if you were skimming it, I think I was just thinking of kind of similar things that Kelly had mentioned where, okay, this I assume it's broken into categories when you look at it. I should just, for voting's sake, because I don't want to ask something that's overwhelming either. May I ask that, is it typically for you, your annual contract list that you, not so much?
I'm trying to think of what you mean by categories.
Okay.
We don't have the level of detail in the ODEP BAM that the state does. And so ours goes into some categories, but there's no easy way for me to pull it out by type or anything like that.
Okay.
And if we pulled it out of our vendor system, you would just have a name.
Right.
So you would need to know what we're paying for, right?
Okay.
And that's what she's talking about the amount of prep we'd have to do on
Yeah.
it.
I just wanted to
I
make
know
sure.
because we did this. She made us do it
That's what you
twice.
You're like, oh, this is fresh in my mind. Okay.
I think we did it many months ago, and
Yeah,
it was
yeah.
pretty deep, and we did it a couple different ways.
Thank you.
I think you understand.
I have a pool of kind of like greens that maybe also, like, you're asking what we're asking as a body.
So we're having some talk that's not on the record here, I think, and so I'm going to pull it back. What is being asked I believe, is for some clarification about this discussion about what you can and cannot do. So I believe that this list of working agreements was established when we did budget cuts significantly starting in '09. And the idea was that we can all get into the budget book and we can say, what does this mean? Or the contract is a really great example because it seems fairly straightforward for us to know what kinds of things are not being done by district employees. But that's our worldview. And then the reality is, I remember the first budget I ever did, my husband was one of 2 or 3 social workers in the district, and the social work budget was enormous. And I was thinking, we're not getting a third of that because the definitions in the budget are so prescribed. So all kinds of things go into something that we would read and say, really, we're spending that much money on that? So I think that complexity, so what we're trying to do with these kinds of decisions is not encumber the district with a project that is going to take them 100 hours between now and Monday. So what they can and cannot do is relative. Did that help at all?
Well, may I comment just quickly on that? What I'm saying is I would now like to hear, again, a synopsis from the district as to what's realistic on everything we've been talking about, because Suzanne's comment changed the equation for me, realizing that if all of the contracts that do go out are first run through the associations who have a chance to say, we could provide this or something like that, that greatly lowers what's at stake. And so to your point, my question to you was, I'd like to know what we might actually be voting on as a question here. And because I don't want to encumber the district at all with an unreasonable request for Monday.
To clarify, what we collaborate with the association on are those contracts that we may be able to perform ourselves. Those are duties and responsibilities we may be able to perform ourselves with existing staff. So the contract we have with our classified association would require us to come into labor management and explain, we're not doing this, but as an example, we don't have enough staff to take care of our landscaping. So have a conversation about how we go about either bringing in more staff for that or contracting out the service for that. That's an example of how we would engage with the association. That's a service contract. That is not every contract. There are literally tens of thousands, and Sarah can correct me, tens of thousands, if not nearing 100,000 contracts that we do in a year, given all of our schools, all of our services, all of the product we purchase. It's an extraordinary amount of contracts that we would have to be looking at to run through the requests that you're making of us.
Nancy.
Ashley?
I just wanted to go back to what I think Sarah said a minute ago, that it was helpful to me to know that you already did that exercise. So maybe we could hear from the superintendent, like what that looked like and what stayed and what left according to the prioritization that we heard from the community and other people. Like that would help me to know that you did that due diligence. I mean, I trust that you did it anyway, but I do feel the need to just from a philosophical standpoint say something at this moment. Like I keep hearing people saying like we can't do any editing of the budget is the takeaway I'm hearing. And it's like we're a budget committee. We are allowed to edit this budget if we have to or need to. And no, maybe it's not culturally okay or the best practice, but we're kind of at a critical juncture here with hundreds of people losing their jobs in the community. And so I feel like it's very stifling to what's supposed to be a transparent and democratic process of oversight of the district to say that we shouldn't be looking at things. I think it's fine for us to look and ask questions. I don't think we want to throw off the team. The team is exhausted doing so much critical work. But like, this is the point of a budget committee, is to dig into the weeds and figure out if we agree with everything that the district has done. Like, we are not district staff, so I think that's probably the heart of some of these questions, but it helps me to hear the superintendent walk through her thinking on digging into those exact things that you're raising.
I'm not gonna be able to tell you what we cut because it was a while ago, but I can kind of give you a sense of the process. So this was prior to the round one cuts. We pulled literally every contract and walked through each one, first with the supervisors most directly involved, and then we brought anything that was a contender, a question mark for a reduction or a cut, into the full exec team process. And the things that we largely or entirely didn't touch were contracted services to students. So I'm going to give you an example of something that may or may not fall in the category of a contract. I genuinely don't know, but we contribute to chariots because we believe that the transportation of young people has a big impact on their lives. We believe that that is part of what allows them to function in a school and a young adult world. We pulled the ridership data to confirm that our assumption was right. And the truth is that our kids are using chariots so much to live their lives and to develop into the people we want them to be. Now, what I'm not sure is whether that's an intergovernmental agreement or whether it's a contract, but those are the kinds of things that we agonized over and didn't touch. There are other things that we did. So when Suzanne was talking about possibly as many as tens of thousands, I can imagine that because there's a lot of contracts that sit inside of things schools do. So sometimes there's licensure, and then there's service agreements that go on with licensure. And the service portions might show up as contracts, not licenses. That's how this thing could get pretty big on us. But with your agreement to let us exclude things that are really about direct services to schools, I think we can get this down to a smaller number. I cannot off the top of my head remember things that we reduced, but I'm going to give you another example. We use contracted services to ensure that our turf fields and our playing fields stay in playing shape. And this is a good example of one we really struggled with. But in the end, athletics are a big part of our school community. And if we let those fall into disrepair, there are costs associated with that too. So these are the kinds of things that we filtered through when we went through these contracts. Suzanne and Sarah, you might remember other good examples if there's ones you want to share. Actually, one more good example is contracted services. So a big number that you'll see is legal services to the district. Not actually a luxury item, a basic item to operations.
Right.
But I think if we can squish this down to meet what we hear the intent of the group is, I think it actually matches what you're calling for, Director Carson Cottingham, which is thoughtful scrutiny and being able to see it in groupings that make the data collection process a little more manageable and give you an order of magnitude on this. Sarah, do you have anything to add on like general order of magnitude?
So I think one thing that's important is when you think about our general fund, we're talking about 1%. So that helps you scale and understand we're not going around writing contracts for consultants and all kinds of stuff all the time. We are pretty conservative with that, like she said.
Yeah.
Catherine?
Yes, that helps. Thank you. And maybe it would be, yeah, the root of that question was, I would just hate to vote to pass the budget. And I'm not saying you would do this because Sarah, you guys have been so careful, but hate to pass it. Then all of a sudden we're like, we're rebranding Salem-Keizer. We're now not maroon anymore. We're a pleasant hue of blue. I wouldn't want to go there with contracts. So I just want to make sure that we're Yeah, we're Sarah's blazer. So I just want to make sure that, I'm doing my due diligence so that we're looking at those contracts and we're preserving what's important, but we have a good eye for, we're cutting teachers. Maybe we don't need, a giant off-site meeting where we, group personalities together or something. I just want to make sure that we're really looking at that.
I think we can be helpful with that with just, again, a little latitude to keep the footprint responsive but manageable.
Right.
I don't know who was first on either side of me. I can't look in both directions at the same moment. Lisa.
I'm just curious, Sarah, you said that you guys had already, or Superintendent and Sarah, you both said that you've already looked at those things. If there was, and I know sometimes in those iterative processes you do things, it's not like you produced a report, but even just sort of going back to say, here's what we did in that so that we could get a sense of what that is, might help the group. And that's just a suggestion as a way to keep it from being a lot of extra work for the district, but I think that might help answer some of the questions.
Yeah.
Precisely. I mean, obviously, if you went through it twice, you're pretty familiar in it, and maybe that would help. So the question from us to you would be, does that help you?
Sure.
Right, would that make it easier?
I think what will make it easier is if you give us the latitude to interpret this. Part of what's hard is you're trying to make it easier, but each suggestion actually opens up another pocket that makes it harder. I do feel like you've been clear on intent, and I think we can satisfy most of what you're looking for. We'll just need a minute to work on that.
Karina?
Yeah, and because I do recognize that we're almost at time. Usually we wrap up by 9 because of our interpretation support. But what I was hearing, and I think to that point, Superintendent, around hearing and if we have an agreement perhaps on wanting information on the types of contract, like the source, right, like the areas. I was curious, some curiosity around the reasoning, right, like understanding why there's some contracts that we're tapping into to make sure that we have that clarity. And then are we still asking for the amount or like the total dollars that are kind of going to each bucket, or are we leaving the dollar amounts out? Like, that's why I was a little curious. But if those are kind of some of the parameters that we can maybe provide and direct, it would be helpful. And then latitude as necessary within some of that.
Satya?
Sarah, you mentioned that out of the general fund, the unrestricted fund, it's just about a percentage of 1% goes towards this contract, and everything else is coming out of the restricted funds. Is that correct? I heard something you mentioned, it's just about 1% of the entire.
Contracts are 1% of the gen fund.
So it's just 1% of gen fund contributes to contract. And so is that all, or is there something coming from the restricted funds as well?
There could also be contracts and
Correct.
grants. I was just trying to scale it.
So what I'm
in
trying to
fund.
say, it's a small percentage in the overall picture. So my suggestion would be, okay, if you have broad categories without even going into the dollar amount, that would at least give us an idea if that is okay. Mm-hmm. The reason I'm saying is because everything else cannot be used for salaries and wages. It's not going to mean that we're going to have extra staff because
6 million.
the contract, there is something else coming from somewhere else. You cannot touch it for this sake. Mm-hmm. So would that be a possibility that will make less burden on the district? They can say, here are some broad categories coming from the general fund.
Yeah. Yeah, and if you guys have already gone through the exercise, so there should be hopefully documentation of what you pulled. I mean, it can be old. But I think maybe another thing that would be helpful is an itemized, so we say $30 million, and I believe that when you went through these contracts, it was to get to that, $30 million in cuts. Maybe you've done great at telling us that you've cut this. It's on page 22. No, wait, I'm sorry. All the things that you cut is on page, where is it? Yeah,
But
Are you
just,
referring to page 9?
9.
8 and 9.
Yeah, what went into that? So when we say we cut 30 million, surely you have like a list of everything that went into that 30 million. That'd be
30
helpful.
million on page 9?
There is no 30 million on page 9.
No, there's not 30 million on page 9.
Where's the list of cuts? Well, there's the 9 mil, yeah, but you're,
Those amounts, and some of them have listed underneath them what kinds of positions, and some of them don't.
We can certainly provide greater detail on each of these aggregate numbers. That's already been published. It's really just a matter of bringing it back to the top of your inbox.
Okay.
Super. We have to go.
We have 5 minutes before we lose our interpretation services.
Okay. My question for the group right now, we've talked around this and around this. The superintendent says she thinks she can get us this information if we give her the latitude to interpret what it is we're saying. Earlier, Suzanne said that she thought it rose to the level of a motion. If we're giving you the latitude, do you still need a motion? And if that's the case, do we have a motion? Do you feel like you need a motion to do the,
I think we should just do the motion.
okay,
Yeah.
let's do the motion. Who is going to make a motion?
So moved.
I'll make it. I mean, can I?
What, a second?
Okay. Okay.
Catherine, do you want to state a motion?
Sure. I motion for the district to provide, what are we saying, categories of contracts to the budget committee. As, okay.
It's been moved and seconded. You want an amendment?
Yeah. I mean, just a friendly amendment. You want the categories that's coming out of the general fund? Or
Yes.
all the types of
Satya, microphone.
Do you want it just the one that's coming out of general fund?
Yes.
Because that will affect the wages.
Right.
All right.
So the motion on the floor is that we ask the district for the broad categories of contracted services in the general fund and give them the latitude. That wasn't in the motion, was it? I'm making things up. So it's been moved by Catherine, seconded by Chrissy. All in favor, thumbs up. Opposed? Okay. Laura, did I see you with the thumb? Okay, thank you. Keep forgetting to look up there. I think with that, we will adjourn and resume on Monday. I do think that it is within the purview of the Budget Committee to make changes in the budget. I have not heard anyone signal that they have a plan to put a motion forward that would make a change. And so I would ask that if you're thinking in that regard, to please connect with myself or Lisa so that we can plan timing and make sure we have the kind of information that we need in the room on Monday to move forward with those kinds of things. And with that, I would say we're adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.